Hey guys, and welcome to the cast. Today I'm thinking about Modern, and particularly within Modern, Mono Red. Mono Red is an archetype that's really dear to my heart. I just enjoy pointing burn spells at people, using goblins, young pyromancer, looting, or destroying artifacts, using cards like Blood Moon, or like hate artifacts plus mono red spells to lock people out of the game, all of which are intrinsic playstyles to the mono red archetype, and I basically have played them all. I absolutely love them throughout every format, so when I come to Modern, I'm a little bit disappointed that when it comes to mono red, there's really no steadfast mono red deck. We have Naya Burn, in terms of an aggressive red strategy. However, pointing lava spikes at your opponent does get a little bit old after a while if that's not entirely your wheelhouse, and Naya Burn is quite an expensive deck to get into Modern with. I actually played the blue-red-white burn deck when we had Treasure Cruise. I played the Naya burn deck, I played the burn deck with Nikotl, and after a while it just got a little bit old for me, because it's not particularly an aggro deck. It definitely is a burn deck that has aggro deck draws if it curves out with only creatures, but when you're playing cards like Eidolon of the Great Revel, I think that your plan is kind of clear, that you're just out to race your opponent. So where do we look in Modern to find a mono-red strategy? And particularly for being the broke college student or college graduate, soon to be that I am, I don't have a lot of money. So, thankfully, mono red, sock full of pennies, is an archetype that tends to show up in formats no matter what. In Modern, I think that one of the most successful budget aggro decks that you can build is Goblins. And Goblins have had their flash in the pan before, thanks to cards like Goblin Rabblemaster, Goblin Piledriver entering the format, but older cards like Goblin Chieftain and Goblin King and Goblin Bushwhacker, for example, are all powerful examples of potent mono-red cards when they fit into a niche strategy. Well, I'm bringing to you today what I hope to be is a very potent niche strategy, tuned for this current meta of like Bant Eldrazi and, oh my god, Avzan Collected Company, and a ton of Dredge, Jund, Affinity, a little bit of Merfolk. We have Breach, but we can't really interact with what they're doing within Breach, but we'll get there. So, let's talk about the list. So, shoutouts to MTGGoldfish. SaffronOlive, actually, upon my research, had the closest shell to those shells that I've been writing down for a while now. One list that I landed on in particular uses Foundry Street Denizen, Goblin Bushwhacker, and Reckless Bushwhacker to go extremely wide and benefit you for going extremely wide. You can use cards like these in other strategies, like if you're using Young Pyromancer or tokens to enable like spells.deck, and then you could use Bedlam Reveler, but for the purposes of this strategy, we're keeping to more lower curve, more hyper-aggressive, and tribal aggro deck because there are payouts for being within tribal goblins. Some of those payouts include Goblin Grenade, Mog War Marshal, I'm sorry, not Mog War Marshal, well, I guess it's pretty decent, but I was thinking Goblin Chieftain, Goblin King, Goblin Rabblemaster, and Goblin Piledriver. These are basically, if the card says Goblin something or other, it's likely that you're going to need a bunch of other goblins to make this card a worthwhile payout. So starting off with the 1-drops, Foundry Street Denizen is my favorite way to start this deck on a budget. I would start out with Goblin Guide if budget was not a concern, but a playset of Goblin Guide actually comes out to almost double the entire price of the main deck of most lists that I come up with. So Goblin Guide will not be in this list due to a concession of budget. Foundry Street Denizen is fantastic as a 4-of because we're going very wide, and then we're going to land one of the 8 Bushwhacker effects that I have in mind here. We're going to go wide enough so that when we Anthem, we can swing past any of our opponent's blockers, which we will render inconsequential. Or we can go very tall with Foundry Street Denizen before they get blockers down on the board. We can also bait out Path and Bolt by making our Foundry Street Denizen large, but we're not investing cards directly into the Denizen. Denizen's pump is just an off product, is a byproduct of what we're doing anyway. The next 1-drop that's extremely powerful is Legion Loyalist. This is a 1-drop rare from Gatecrash. It is a 1/1 haste with Battalion. When it swings with at least 2 other creatures you control until the end of the turn gain first strike, trample, and your opponent and cannot be blocked by creature tokens this turn. So Legion Loyalist is particularly useful against token strategies. They render Master of Waves entirely useless, which is funny because Master of Waves is a phenomenal card against our strategy, but we can push through it with Legion Loyalist as well as Goblin Piledriver having protection from blue. Where was I? Right. The Legion Loyalist with Battalion, it's pretty important that we get Battalion up, because then we can start using instant speed burn spells as combat tricks if our creatures are worth more damage than our burn spells would be in the long run as burn spells. So one of the key strategies in learning mono red as an efficient red mage is, when are my burn spells better off used as removal? Sometimes that's very obvious when your opponent has like a lifelink creature and they target it with an aura, and you say, okay, well, lightning bolt is great here, here's the 2-for-1. But sometimes it's a little less clear. However, Legion Loyalist is important in the strategy not just for its battalion trigger, because it has haste. And we need a lot of our creatures to have haste, because there are going to be hands that necessitate us to kill a creature that's going to make our life difficult, like Tarmogoyf if we don't have a proper answer down the road, or, well, that's not really the best example, but more like a lifelink threat, or a threat that's going to hold a weapon. So Legion Loyalist, while being good against tokens, the First Strike and Trample is also very useful with the burn that we have. The haste assembles Battalion quickly, so he's decent in multiples. However, I don't think you keep hands with a ton of Legion Loyalists unless you're against, like, black-white tokens or some strategy that's going to gum up the board very quickly with token creatures. Next up, we have Mog Fanatic. Now, this would be the slot in which I would put Goblin Guide, and SaffronOlive said himself in the Deck Tech video and article that Mog Fanatic is not a fantastic card on paper, because it's not extremely shiny. I mean, it's a common, it's a 1/1, you can sacrifice it to Flame Jab, and I think Flame Jab, because I'm pretty sure Flame Jab hits a person? Let's check on that. Yeah, cool. So it's Flame Jab. Something to keep in mind, it doesn't look phenomenal on paper, Mog Fanatic, but it doesn't cost anything and it's not constrained by time, so Mog Fanatic actually adds up with all of the reach in your deck, so you can pretty seamlessly swing for a bunch of damage and then kill them over the top with burn once your opponent starts to stabilize a board, if you do let that happen by not using your removal spells on their creatures instead of in the face. Mog Fanatic also serves a purpose on the battalion. You could swing in with Legion Loyalist, assemble a battalion, and then use Mog Fanatic in response to blocks but before damage to put damage on the creature, and therefore killing it after the battalion trigger has resolved when your creatures have First Strike and Trample. Mog Fanatic also works well to ping a whole bunch of X1 creatures in the format, such as Wild Nacatl before there's a... Oh, that's not very likely. Let me move on to a different example. A Lingering Soul token, a human, an elf, any 1/1 like White Weenie Human, any Goblin in the mirror that's not Goblin, and not any 1-drop Goblin that's not Goblin Guide, as well as Noble Hierarch, Birds of Paradise, Dark Confidant, and Fairy Conclave if you do see that man land, etc., etc. Mog Fanatic also teams up with Lightning Bolt to take down a X4 creature, which sometimes are boarded in against red aggressive strategies like such as Wall of Omens and Courser of Kruphix. Moving on, we have so far 12 1-drops to start our deck off, and we can get on the floor very quickly because we want to go 1-drop, double 1-drop on turn 1-2 almost every time. How else are we rounding out the 1-drops? Well, to round out, I have 2 or 3, or 1, I'm not really sure how many I want to main copies of Frenzied Goblin. So in my testing, Frenzied Goblin has been a powerful card in Standard. I played a lot of it in the Boss Slide deck that was like half a Heroic deck, half a Rabble Red deck. I played it in Rabble Red, I played it in full-on Heroic. The card fits in a lot of aggressive red shells because it's an aggressive red enabler that just so happens to carry the Goblin typing that's so important to our Lords and to, just to our Lords and to our Goblin Grenade, basically. Frenzied Goblin targets lifelinking creatures that are left back intently to block profitably our creatures, and it also deals well with vigilant creatures, and it deals well with First Strike, and so on and so on. So long as the creature in question doesn't have hexproof or protection from red or shroud or something like that, you can target it and get those blocks right out of the way. Unfortunately, however, Frenzied Goblin is a little bit mana hungry. It's a little bit funny to say mana hungry because it only costs 1 red to activate, but we're only going to be on like 18 or 19 lands, so we won't have a ton, and we do need to dedicate more spells to the board and basically go Hellbent as fast as possible so that we can, in most cases, finish our opponent out very quickly by committing our spells to the board and then going over the rest of the top with burn if necessary. Frenzied Goblin is basically I mean, he can easily be dealt with because he's a 1/1, but the purpose of him is often a one-shot combat that gets so much damage in that it's very hard for your opponent to stabilize after such. The unfortunate thing as well is that he does not have haste. However, you can use him in tandem with like Goblin Bushwhacker or Reckless Bushwhacker with their triggers. Their triggers give all other creatures this turn you control haste. So you can haste your Frenzied Goblin, and then as long as you have enough mana afterwards, you can pay to make another creature not block. So for all of the 1-drops I have in mind, there are 3 definite playsets that I'll be playing. Foundry Street Denizen, Foundry Street Denizen, Legion Loyalist, and Frenzied Goblin. I don't count Goblin Bushwhacker as a 1-drop because he's effectively a 2-drop, but that 2-drop usually comes down on like turn 3 or 4 after a bigger board has been established. You're hard-pressed to find a spot where it's correct to just go Foundry Street Denizen, land, kick Goblin Bushwhacker, because you're only getting in for like 5 damage, or even less than that, actually. Oh yeah, 5 damage, because he buffs himself. Anyway, moving on. SaffronOlive does have a 1-off Raging Goblin in his list. Being that SaffronOlive's Goblin budget list, or 8-whack as he calls it, which is a very accurate moniker, being that it's budget for the reason of also not playing Goblin Guide and just his budget series articles, he has this Raging Goblin slot. Personally, I don't think that it's worth playing such a weak card in that slot. You're probably better off playing a support spell that doesn't carry the Goblin typing. It just is better to your strategy in general. For example, you can jam Forked Bolt in the main deck, or you can jam a copy of like Flame Slash or something. You want more redundancy. You don't necessarily need a 1/1 haste. Your deck is full of creatures that can either generate haste or are better 1/1s because they can evolve into better things. Moving on to 2-drops now. The first playset is Mogg War Marshal. Coming in at 2-drop with 2 for Echo, he enters the battlefield or dies and gives you a 1/1 Goblin. So when he enters, he gives you a Goblin, and when he dies, he leaves a Goblin behind so long as he actually goes to the graveyard. Mogg War Marshal looks very similar to Krenko's Command and Dragon Fodder, but there is a minute difference here between the 2 cards. Mogg War Marshal, for one, carries the Goblin typing and is a creature. And that's important because we want creatures that are goblins, that way they can have the benefit from Goblin Chieftain and Goblin King. Additionally, we want creatures because we need to sacrifice creatures to Goblin Grenade in order to 5 someone or something, but let's be real here, we're probably shooting our opponent in the face. Mogg War Marshal, wow. Between the Moggs and all of the Goblin prefixes, like this deck is actually really confusing to rattle off. Mogg War Marshal is also good because you can sacrifice him to Goblin Grenade, leaving behind a Goblin, which is more value than just using Krenko's Command or Dragon Fodder, where you only net 1 Goblin at the end of that exchange. Additionally, you can pay the Echo, but it's almost always correct to not pay the Echo because you get 1 additional enter the battlefield trigger for Foundry Street Denizen when you let Mogg War Marshal die, as opposed to the 2-drop sorceries that create 2 goblins. So yeah, Mogg War Marshal is a quintessential part of this deck because on turn 2 it begins your process of going wide. He's strong in multiples because you go wide faster, and the deck is consistent enough in its redundant, I say late game, but like turn 3, turn 4 Anthem abilities with the Bushwhackers. And you need like enough cards that do that. I mean, I was considering playing cards like Krenko's Command or Hordling Outburst, but Mogg War Marshal makes the most sense considering Goblin Grenade, and it's a cheaper spell than Hordling Outburst, which will allow us to surge easier. So that's, I think, what I want to say about Mogg War Marshal. Moving on, we have, I believe you should play a playset of Goblin Piledriver, especially in the budget list, where you need to find like more reasons to play this deck because you're not playing Goblin Guide in particular. So I want to clarify this. Goblin Guide does not make or break this strategy at all. Mono red aggro can traditionally swap in a whole bunch of different cards in certain slots, and you'll see minute differences if you're a really astute, like hyper aggressive Magic player, where you're very good at combat math and sequencing and knowing what cards put together will amount to certain amounts of damage in certain spaces. But the reason why Sock Full of Pennies is a name for these like cheap mono red budget aggro decks is that they're pretty easily interchangeable. I don't think your opponent is going to feel a whole lot different if you beat them with a sock full of pennies versus a sock full of dollar coins. They're still heavy and they hit hard, but you do miss a couple points of damage when you don't have the Goblin Guide as opposed to when you don't have heavy hitters as opposed to just all crappy cards. So Goblin Piledriver, like, his payout is so high in this strategy because you're all goblins. I don't really see a reason not to play 4, even if you consider them clunky, because you are playing less than optimal red cards. You're not playing a red good stuff deck, you're playing red tribal in order to make your payouts have such a higher ceiling that certain cards shine brighter in your crappier shell than the average card in a good stuff shell. And the good stuff shell, in terms of the mono red archetype, probably lends itself to Naya Burn, or like maybe some streamlined red like Zoo, like maybe Burning Tree Emissary Zoo type deck in Modern. But for our purposes, we're using Goblins because the payout spells are easily attainable in terms of actual money, and they're cheap, which fits the hyper-aggressive strategy. 4 Goblin Piledriver makes a lot of sense. It pushes through Master of Waves, sure, but it also pushes through Snapcaster Mage, and it also pushes through like any blue-green tempo strategy like Delver, or not necessarily blue-green, but I was thinking of like blue-green dudes. Tempo, like Delver, it pushes right through there. If your opponent if playing like Spirits, I know like that's a deck that people are trying to get to work in Modern. I believe that they're all part blue, except for Selfless Spirit. It also pushes through Spell Queller, and it gets huge. Goblin Piledriver gets +2/+0 until the end of the turn for each other attacking Goblin, which works quite well with Legion Loyalist, considering while Goblin Piledriver goes tall, while you go wide, Legion Loyalist allows going tall to be beneficial because you have Trample and First Strike. So even if your opponent has like a death-touching Rattlesnake type effect, you can push right through with your battalion. And the curve is easy to do there. Additionally, you can hold your Piledrivers in hand for plays where you use your Bushwhackers and give them haste so that you don't just present them for sorcery speed removal and then you don't have as big beaters later on. So I suppose the idea that I'm getting towards here is building and playing mono red is kind of typically condescended upon because it's thought of like a mouth breather strategy where you just point bolts at your opponent until they die, and if they can facilitate if they can recover, then they can recover, and you just get outplayed because you're a bad player for playing hyper aggressive linear strategies. However, finding these key differences that other players that don't dedicate time to this very specific archetype, especially like within Modern. I mean, Legacy Goblins is a known archetype, but let's not open that that chest, Pandora's Legacy Goblin box there. Especially players that don't dedicate the time to like studying those differences. Like your average Dun player is not going to know why you play a certain Goblin over like another like just higher power red card, like maybe Forked Bolt, until they get hit by that board state that you're able to assemble. And the more cards that you can hold in hand because you know when their sequencing is correct, the better, because you're not just presenting them for removal and you're not giving your opponent needless information until it's time for that information to be public information. So let's just recap what we have so far, because I have to keep in mind that you're not looking at this yet and I'm just talking about it. We have 4 Foundry Street Denizen, 4 Legion Loyalist, 4 Mog Fanatic. Mog Fanatic is more often going to be used to pick off X1 creatures when we can do that, but he swings with the Goblin typing, so we're happy to have him. And 2 Frenzied Goblin to make for 14 1-drops that I actually want to play on 1. We do have the playset of Goblin Bushwhacker, but it's very unlikely we play that on 1 unless we open too many of them. Additionally, 4 copies of Goblin Piledriver and 4 copies of Mog War Marshal, so that we're very fast on 1-drops, but we can also go wide quickly, and we have a weapon for going wide now. So what are some other benefits to going wide? Well, SaffronOlive named his deck 8-Whack because he has 8 Bushwhacker effects. If you're unfamiliar with Goblin Bushwhacker, or the Bushwhacker reference I keep making, there are 2 different goblins. The original one is Goblin Bushwhacker. It's a 1/1 for 1 red that has 1 red kicker. When it ETBs, all creatures you control, not just other, get +1 and 0 and gain haste until the end of the turn. His cost goes up with kicker. By proxy, Reckless Bushwhacker's cost goes down, but it is a similar effect. This guy is a 3-drop that becomes a 2-drop with Surge. This guy is currently in Standard. Surge is a standard legal keyword. He's a 2/1 with haste, and when he enters the battlefield, all other creatures get 1/0 until the end of the turn, and that's other because he starts at 2/1 because he has the possibility to be hard-casted, and you want him to not be completely like terrible on a hard cast for like limited purposes and such. So, with the 8 Bushwhackers and all of the cards that we've talked about so far, I believe that we should have 27 creatures. Right. So that takes me to my last, I say playset with a question mark, playset of creatures. The Lords. Lords are very important to any deck that wants to go very wide. And when I say Lords, traditionally I think Lords, they come from like Lord of Atlantis and that type of effect. That's just all creatures of a certain type get 1/1. Well, our Lord of choice is Goblin Chieftain. He's a 3-drop, red 1 for a 2/2. He has haste. He also says other goblin creatures you control have 1/1 and haste. Get 1/1 and haste, whatever. So he is a nice outlet for allowing you to hold goblin pile drivers until absolutely necessary. He also allows your Mog War Marshals to get aggro with all of the goblin friends to get aggro quickly. He helps your battalion become assembled whenever you need it to, instead of just going 1-drop, double 1-drop, if you're sure that your opponent sides in Pyroclasm, for example. And he helps your Frenzied Goblin come down with haste and take out blocks when it's important. So part of playing Goblins is like knowing the matchup against your opponent and like knowing what creatures they'll play so that you can present enough without overextending into some sort of sweep that you'll have enough gas to push through. Although, being that we're making our deck very low to the ground, very curve-oriented, you'll often just have nut draws that don't very much care about what your opponent is presenting because you can push through a plethora and excess damage. Goblin Chieftain brings the creature count up to 33. So, the rest of the deck is mountains because we have so many double red in our spells. Actually, it's not a lot of literally double red in spells, it's just that all of our 1-drops are 1 red, and being that we're going double 1-drop or just tagging on 1-drops to our other plays, we need to have all red sources. However, I think that it could be correct to play 1 copy of Mutavault in the board like I was doing in Standard and so many people were doing in Standard when Legion Loyalist and Foundry Street Denizen and Frenzied Goblin were all in the same standard. Mutavault has the benefit of having every creature type, which allows it to be a goblin for your lords, and assembles battalion because it's a man-land and doesn't die to sorcery speed removal. Additionally, if you're playing against very grindy matchups, you could bring in the Mutavault and he could just be a standalone guy post-Wrath to swing in for 2, while, like I said earlier, just dodging sorcery speed removal. But he does get bigger with your Chieftain, and he gets pumped off of the Bushwhacker effects so long as you animate him in time for the Bushwhackers to come down. The rest of the deck that aren't lands or creatures are burn spells, so that's not really a big surprise within the mono-red archetype. The burn spells of choice are 4 Lightning Bolt. This card is phenomenal, and if your deck is red and Lightning Bolt is legal, you should play 4 copies. Our other payout spell is Goblin Grenade as a 4 of. It's a 1-drop sorcery that you additionally need to sack a goblin in order to cast. Well, it literally says, sacrifice a goblin, Goblin Grenade deals 5 damage to target creature or player. 5 damage. The funny thing about this is if you resolve 4, your opponent should actually just die. But the other funny thing is in Modern, your opponents generally are shocking and fetching quite a lot, so you won't need to resolve 4 of these between the combat that you're presenting, the Lightning Bolts and the Mog Fanatics also burning, and Goblin Grenade dealing, quite literally, 25% of their starting life total. So, the initial shell that I had in mind for Goblins is very, very, very much in line with SaffronOlive's 8-whack Goblins deck. It's using full playsets of Denizen, which benefits from going wide, the Bushwhackers, which want you to go wide, Goblin Chieftain being the best main deck lord, so I don't think that I need to speak very much more about the main deck construction. Actually, a lot of the potency, I don't even know if that's a word, a lot of the efficacy of a mono-red deck comes from having accurate sideboards and accurate sideboard knowledge. So, mono-red strategies always want to catch their opponent with their pants down. And an average level player that picks up a mono-red deck can kill their opponent if their curve is good, but post-board, much like decks like Affinity and Infect, mono-red can get hated out by seemingly dinky hate cards like, for example, Anger of the Gods and Pyroclasms won't do a lot to your average mid-range deck or a good stuff deck, but this deck is pretty polarized in that it's always the aggressive strategy. How are we going to combat cards that seem to just destroy us when they resolve? Well, the first thing that you could do is not play into them. Anger of the Gods is 1, sorcery speed removal, and 2, Two, this one, like, I hesitate to say, but it's double red, so if you can get your opponent to, like, if you can influence them with the cards that you put out first to look for other answers whose lands don't cater to double red, you can catch your opponent having to fetch and shock to cast that Anger of the Gods, which simulates getting 3 damage in, which is basically like some goblin swinging in with some sort of buff. So that creature swung in, even though he didn't exist, at least once, because you got your opponent to inefficiently look for an answer for something that they really shouldn't have had to look for that early. So it's all about sequencing. Additionally, sideboarding is extremely important because when you're mono red, you can expect basically everything that's coming in against you. They're cards that are popular in Modern for a reason. Anger of the Gods, Pyroclasm. Cards such as Drown in Sorrow don't see as much play because when you're in like black like that, you're also usually within red for Jund. But if you're Abzan, Golgari Charm is also something to think about. If you're playing against Abzan, I should say. Dragon Claw is a card that people are packing for Burn, the 2-drop artifact that gives you 1 life whenever a player casts a red spell. I mean, you're a mono-red deck, so you're even more often going to trigger it, but, well, I think every spell in Burn is also red. But, point being, you need to sideboard wisely against sideboarded cards. You can't just sideboard against the Game 1 deck, because it's likely you have the best matchup against, most Game 1 decks, because you're kind of built in a way that Affinity and Infect are built. You're hyper-aggressive, and you're a very strong Game 1 deck that wants to catch most decks dirtling around that are playing cards to try to not be a polarized strategy in the way that we are. So how do we sideboard against our opponent's sideboarding? Well, like I was getting at earlier before I kind of got stuck on a different idea, you can pretty easily expect what's being brought in against you, but most players don't have a acute knowledge of the going deep mono-red sideboard decks. So obviously there's Dragon's Claw, which is good against any sort of hyper-aggressive mirror, so long as that deck is red. So it's really good against any sort of Goblin mirror, but it's particularly being brought in against Burn. And I think it's correct to have a bunch of copies of this card in our board, because Burn could be a tough matchup post-board, since I expect them to have the full copies of Searing Blaze and Searing Blood. And that's a 2-for-1 card, and we need to soften the blow on all of their spells, because their spells are so good at picking off our board state that the game is going to go long, and if the game goes long, Dragon Claws gains us enough life so that they need to draw a lot of excess spells to take our life total down to 0. But we also need to deal with Eidolon of the Great Revel, because there is not a spell in our deck that doesn't trigger Eidolon of the Great Revel. So don't side out any removal against Burn. Definitely keep in all of your removal and keep in all of your early aggression. However, I think it could be correct to take out Frenzied Goblin, since there's no real threat of a profitable blocker from the opponent, except for a card like Spellskite, which I think is easily dealt with Smash to Smithereens. Now, Smash to Smithereens, that's a really good segue, by the way. Smash to Smithereens is a card that I think you play 4 copies of. Naiad Burn decks are already playing Destructive Revelry, and some decks are even going as far to play 4, because you need to deal with Affinity, yes, but you need to deal with all of these artifact hate cards that certain decks can side into. Ensnaring Bridge spiked in price a couple of months ago because someone went really deep down their rabbit hole to realize, wow, Burn really doesn't have a good answer to Ensnaring Bridge. Similar cards that exist to annoy the Naya Burn deck are Leyline of Sanctity. While we can't interact with Leyline of Sanctity, it's not as much of a problem for us, since our source of damage is repeatable. It's in the form of creatures. So we need to worry more about cards like Ensnaring Bridge, Dragon's Claw, Spellskite, which can eat our bolts and make for an annoying blocker to deal with, and such. So we just have Smash to Smithereens. We also don't have access within Mono Red to deal with enchantments, so in strategies where you're very worried about enchantments, and I can't think of one right off the top of my head outside of Boggles, you just have to out-aggro them and use any other sideboard card that makes sense. So far I know that I want at least 2 or 3 copies of Dragon's Claw and 3 to 4 copies of Smash to Smithereens. SaffronOlive has the 4th Goblin Piledriver in his board, but I'm pretty sure that's a product of just not knowing how many copies to play in the main. I'm sure he brings it in against Grixis Delver and Merfolk and Blue Moon and those decks that are shell blue, but I think that it belongs in the main due to the potential power ceiling on that. I'm okay siding a couple copies out when you expect literally everything to always be dying, but I don't think that that's quite often going to happen where you first side out pile drivers instead of other things. More often than not, you're siding out frenzied goblins and Mog Fanatics, since they're just either Mog Fanatic is just either frenzied goblin is just not great in a certain matchup because of the blocking clause being irrelevant, or Mog Fanatic just being generally the weakest card in the strategy in our deck. So we have Smash and we have Dragon's Claw, but we also need to talk about Forked Bolt. Forked Bolt is an absolutely stellar card for this strategy because it can deal with 2 X1 creatures at once for only 1 mana. Although Forked Bolt is not an instant, I don't think that should deter you from wanting to play it because goblins in general are a tap-out strategy where you present everything, and if your opponent has an efficient answer, then they do have it. You do, like I said earlier, have some influence over getting your opponent to find a certain answer, whether it be like how they use their mana because of the creature you present, or just not committing enough to the board that your opponent uses their wrath early. But Forked Bolt I don't believe is one of those cards. It's one of the more reactive things that you could do within our strategy, which is funny to say because it's only like a 1-drop sorcery. It's really not all that powerful on its own. Forked Bolt is great because your opponents, if they're on any sort of deck with Lingering Souls or Kitchen Finks, are definitely going to want those, and Forked Bolt can efficiently deal with the tokens off Lingering Souls over 2 bodies, and Kitchen Finks just dies no matter what its persist count is, persisted or not, with Forked Bolt, I should say. Now with that in mind, I can always find a couple cards that just seem to always be stellar in the board of a strategy, but the rest of that board, once I start hitting a roadblock, I will check the recent standings of Modern decks. And I know off of the top of my head from following the Modern Open that Dredge is extremely popular. Collected Company strategies are popular, with Abzan being the color of choice, I believe. And Bant Eldrazi and other Eldrazi strategies being popular, as well as Affinity, Burn, and Jund are kind of just like mainstays within the high-tier Modern. Merfolk are also a solid aggro deck that happens to be tribal as well. So with all of these cards that I've mentioned, what have already been addressed? Forked Bolt is quite powerful against Affinity, and it's also solid against Merfolk to an extent. You could kill like Curse Catcher and Silvergill Adapt, but once the Lords start coming down, that can be tough, and you don't really want to draw Forked Bolt too late. So I'm not sure how great it is, but I know I would definitely side a few copies in. Dragon's Claw addresses just burn from what we spoke of, but it does it so well that I think you keep it. However, if you do run into a hyper-aggressive matchup where you feel it's correct that you just need to gain a certain amount of life based on what you saw in Game 1, you could bring Dragon's Claw in even if your opponent's not triggering it because you're a mono-red deck and you have like 41 to 42 red spells in your deck, so you can gain a good amount of life. And Smash to Smithereens deals with cards like Ensnaring Bridge, which we might see out of certain tap-out or lockout strategies like Lantern Control. It also deals with the Lantern itself, but from everything that we've discussed, it deals with the Dragon's Claw out of Naya Burn's sideboard, and perhaps you'll see that in Zoo as well. And it also deals with Affinity, deals with Cranial Plating and Vault Scourge, which are on the top of my list. Ravager can also be a pain to deal with, but it's funny to say this, I think he's actually a little bit slow against us. What else can we use? Well, we see a lot of Dredge and Jund running around. Jund seems to do okay against Dredge, but they don't have many exile from graveyard effects outside of the side, so I think Jund has to side against Dredge kind of hard, but let's not get too deep into that. For Dredge, we have, off the top of my head, three extremely solid options. 2 are better than the last one. The okay one I'm thinking of is Magma Spray. It's 1-drop instant that deals 2 damage to just a creature, but it exiles it when it would die. Pretty powerful effect. I don't really love the 2-drop burn spells in Goblins, because this deck is very mana hungry, very fast. And just the cheaper the better, really. It deals with the one thing that would probably bring it in against most often, and those things could be like Voice of Resurgence, Kitchen Finks, or combo pieces that they want in Grave, for example. Another solid option for dealing with the Grave is Tormod's Crypt, which happens to be in SaffronOlive's sideboard. I like Tormod's Crypt because it's powerful for what it does. It exiles the entire Grave. We don't care about our own Grave, although Tormod's Crypt doesn't hurt it, but for points where we can play cards that are symmetrical for both players and we break symmetry in terms of our strategy doesn't care, those tend to be better than cards that are like those cards but slightly cheaper. So Tormod's Crypt is free and only exiles one opponent's graveyard. However, and it sacrifices itself to do so. However, the next step up that has that symmetrical clause that I was talking about is Relic of Progenitus. And Relic of Progenitus can either tap to exile a specific card, which is powerful enough typically for when we bring in Graveyard Hate, because like either they're a Reanimator strategy, or they're a Dredge strategy, and they're just mass reanimation. Because the second part of Relic is the symmetrical clause. Both players exile both graveyards, and you draw a card. Draw a card is cute. Relic only costs 1 mana, so it's not really a whole lot to do. But the exiling both graveyards, that's a huge benefit, because you're not taxed into blowing your Relic immediately, so you can put your opponent's graveyard under pressure without even investing mana the turn after you cast it. But you can also have that big shot to blow the whole graveyard, and you cantrip, which is extremely important in decks that look for reach later on in the game. With that in mind, the more I speak about Relic, the more I think that this card could actually be pushed into the main deck for a couple of reasons. Dredge is entirely popular right now, and the reason that I'm worried about Dredge is because they can put a lot of power on the board, which can race us, and our deck does not want to block because we don't have as many lines to victory when we start chump blocking. We need all of our bodies to swing and then get buffed, so that we could finish off with burn if necessary. So I think Relic is very powerful against these Dredge strategies that want to bring back Bloodghasts and Prized Amalgams. If the strategies start to lean more towards flashback, and instead of like these triggers, and they start casting things from the grave, I could definitely be convinced to run Ash Zealot, who has that clause where if a player, I think an opponent, casts a spell from a grave, it deals 3 damage to them. I mean, she's already a 2/2 haste first strike for 2. So, very reasonable battalion enabling card there, but for our purposes, I think Relic of Progenitus is actually extremely strong in our strategy. Also, Relic and Tormod's Crypt, Relic is 1, so it's not very hard to cast in our strategy. Tormod's Crypt is free, which can be used to, like, Surge Reckless Bushwhacker on only 2 lands, which is a nice trick. So, there's some play there. Lastly, the secret tech that I've been considering is Goblin King. So, of all of the decks that I've spoke about, Affinity, Jund, Dredge, and kind of harped on Dredge too much, but it's really spiked in popularity. What else? Let's take a look at MTG Top 8 to see what we could expect and jog my memory here. Right, Zoo, Jund, Affinity, different variants of Eldrazi, Merfolk, Red Deck Wins, which is improperly named, it's supposed to be Burn. Junk, which is Abzan. Hate Bears are on the decline. They have a tough time against Dredge. Nahiri Jeskai. Tron, be it green-red, usually. And Scapeshift seem to be the popular aggro and popular control strategies. Grixis is on a bit of a decline, but I think it's worth mentioning because I know so many Grixis players in real life that maybe it's not as represented from online metrics, but I know locally it's very represented. And as for combo or combo aggro, we have Dredge on a very steep incline. Infect on a steep decline. I imagine it's having a hard time with all the burn running around the Jund and the Dredge deck with so many blockers and access to cheap burn. And Creature's Toolbox, that's funny. I know that's probably Kiki Cord. So of all of these decks I've mentioned, Kiki Cord has Mountain. So does Dredge. So does Jeskai Nahiri. So does Green Red Tron. So does Scapeshift. So does Grixis. So does Jund. So does Zoo. So does Red Affinity, but I wouldn't bring in Goblin King there. So does Burn, and so do Delver strategies. So Goblin King, I believe, is an extremely potent sideboard tech at this point. It's less effective in a larger matchup spread than Goblin Chieftain, because haste in the Anthem is typically better than Mountain Walk if the Mountain Walk is not... haste is always good, whereas Mountain Walk is you want it in certain matchups. But I think Goblin King is a powerful side because, one, it's big enough that you can save it for after the Wraths. Again, not committing enough that you just completely get left without gas. And two... these decks that I'm talking about, like especially Dredge and Jund, like, are very interested in blocking, and even like the Titan Breach deck with like they bring in Coursers or like Wall of Roots, and then like they get down Titans and Kitchen Finks. They're interested in blocking and gaining a bit of life, but we're going to take blocking entirely out of the equation so long as we hold on to Goblin King. If we have Goblin Chieftains or other Goblin Kings in tandem with the original Goblin King, we can even get his toughness out of bolt range since he starts at 2, so you only need 2 other lords. So there's a lot of play here with what we could do in the board, and like Goblin King, I'm sure people know about, but you never play against it in Modern, and it's being left in the board, so there's no visual reminder of it in the main deck. So how many people are going to bring in extra removal for the 3-drop Lord that I'm probably going to wait to cast until after your Wrath? Unless I'm on the play and I can just kill you right then and there by playing the Goblin King and swinging with Unblockable. Point being, there's a little bit of sideboard tech to probably every strategy that you could play in any format, but I'm just more polished on this mono-red strategy. So these are my thoughts on Goblins as of right now, and I hope I didn't forget anything extremely important. I went through SaffronOlive's list for a reminder, so again, shoutouts to him for a phenomenal job putting this information out there for all Magic players and Magic enthusiasts alike to use it as a publicly accessible knowledge. Wow, it's getting a little late. I'm just kind of tired. Shoutouts also to the FCG series for letting us see a whole bunch of people play Modern on stream, and I guess shoutouts to the Uncommons, which is my favorite local store here in New York, where I see a lot of Modern play and meet a lot of awesome Magic players. So I hope this, somewhat of a primer, or this cast has been informative and interesting for anyone that's interested in Modern or Mono Red or anything that having to do with what we discussed. Yeah, I'm just looking down these cards. I don't think I left anything out, but I will quickly recap with a few cards that we're not playing that are Modern legal. Perhaps you've seen them in other builds of Mono Red Goblins. We're not playing Aether Vial because the card is not aggressive and is a completely poor top deck in the late game, where it's just bad if you don't have it on 1 in the strategy because you don't have much staying power past like turn 6. And Siege Gang Commander, which is a powerful card in its own right, but typically, like, the reason why it's powerful is because you're cheating it into play off of, like, Goblin Lackey or an Aether Vial. So that card doesn't make the cut for us, and we're just too low to the ground for it. You could also sideboard into Eidolon of the Great Revel in matchups like that are semi-combo, like Dredge and like Storm, where you don't feel like between their post-board removal and the initial speed of their strategy's clock that you can effectively race them. You could bring in Eidolon, although you have to be extremely careful because Eidolon could very well kill you, being that you don't have main deck life gain, but you can bring it in alongside the Dragon's Claw as well, especially against Burn. I don't think that they expect to play against Eidolon post-board, so I don't think that they would side accordingly. And it's just another thing that they have to point at with their burn and not at your face, which gives you more longevity, and you have renewable damage and they don't. So, again, these are my thoughts. I hope it's been great. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you guys next time.